Our presenters range from folks who have spent many decades, I think, setting the ground and showing visionary leadership on the access to justice front. People such as Carol Lee Smith, Patricia Hughes, and Penny Goldsmith. And we have others who are at the very start of their careers, articling students with big ideas like Nayuri Nalantaw and Samantha Peters of Between the Lines. In this room, we have as participants an abundance of thought leaders, I would say, and experienced workers. We have government policymakers and lawyers, public legal educators from across the country, community legal clinics, legal aid folks, a variety of legal professionals, funders, law society ventures, community workers, students, and more. Welcome all of you to this event. We hope that the 2 days give you an opportunity to meet and hear from others trying to increase participation in the justice system and to have an opportunity to share your own experiences. We are pretty convinced that this unique combination of people will, with coming at the access to justice challenges from very different angles, perspectives, places, will lead us to coming up with some good ideas for improving, increasing access to justice. I think that there's no single right answer or solution, but there's great potential and possibilities if we work together. Before I forget, I also want to express our appreciation and gratitude for the Law Foundation of Ontario's support for this event and the Law Society of Upper Canada's support for this event. I will now move to a few housekeeping notes. The bathrooms are just down the hall. That way? Anyway, one or the other down the hall. If you indicated on your registration that you are vegan or gluten-free, please check in with us at lunch as we have your food separately. Thirdly, you may be recorded today. TAG is recording our keynote and plenaries for use in their upcoming podcast on access to justice. So that may be happening, and there may be some media around. Finally, please join us. Please join TAG for a wine and cheese reception at Osgood Hall, hosted by the Law Society of Upper Canada in the Upper and Lower Barristers Lounge. Ask many of us if you know how to get there. It starts right after this ends at 5 o'clock. And finally, I wanted to mention something that we would like you to do today when you have a spare moment, and that is to cast a ballot for the topic of discussion at tomorrow morning's town hall. So tomorrow we will have a town hall which will be an open, facilitated brainstorming discussion based on or relying on audience participation to talk about one of the pressing justice systems of the day. So we want to hear from you as to what topic you would most like to discuss. And so there will be, I think, 4 topics that you can vote on. One is public confidence in the justice system. Is it a problem of perception? Is the public under-informed? That's the first one. The second one is limits of access to justice in an adversarial, expert-driven system. The third one is working with the digital divide. Many of us feel a push to rely more and more on the internet for our public legal education and access to justice work. How do we do this so we do not exacerbate already existing barriers to access to justice? And is what we do effective? And finally, educating and licensing new lawyers and paralegals. How do we reform the law school process so that it better supports access to justice? And the LPP program is only a small part. I think that all of those options are set out when you go out to vote, so if you took notes, probably, I'm hoping you didn't need to because I think it will be obvious when you go out there. But we would encourage you to vote. That's the whole idea. And we will announce the topic before we leave today, so you can ponder it with your, after evening, when you have your evening slow downtime. So I think that's all I was supposed to cover in my welcoming remarks, except to now turn it over to, there are many of us here working on a useful, interesting learning experience for all of you, so please approach us. I would now like to introduce Grant Wedge, who is the Vice President for Policy, Equity, and Public Affairs for the Law Society of Upper Canada, and he will introduce our keynote speaker.
Ani, bonjour, kwe, sego, tanse, bonjour, welcome. Julie started by acknowledging the traditional territories that we're on. Very often, that's the way it's introduced, traditional territories. And at a public legal education conference, I just want us to take a moment to reflect that it's not about what was. And too often, I think it's right now a little bit of a way we start by saying, we're very honored to be here on the traditional territory that Mississaugas have been credit and recognize the long tradition of Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Métis, other Indigenous peoples who have made Toronto their home, Toronto, the place where sticks stand in the water. And I think it's important for us to reflect that it's not just about the past, although that's an important part of what we're doing in Canada right now as part of, and let's call it what it is, decolonization. It's also about presence. And when we say the traditional territories, we're also talking about the fact that there are Mississaugas, Anishinaabe people, who live and work along with so many other Indigenous people here in Toronto and in Ontario. So if it's about the past and the present, the most important thing for us, I think, is to also reflect upon what does it mean for us when we acknowledge our relationship with the land and the people who have been here. And I think if there's one takeaway from what I'm going to say to you, is that we have responsibilities. That's why we're so pleased to have Dr. Cindy Blackstock starting off this conference, these 2 days of dialogue about access to justice. If we think of what Gord Downey is doing with tragically hip Cheney Wenjack, is it a story about a young First Nations kid who died on the railway tracks 50 years ago, trying to get away from an oppressive residential school back to his family? Is it just about the story in the past? No. Gord Downey, tragically hip, are putting on our agenda what are we doing today about the fact that there are more kids, Indigenous youth, in the justice system than ever went through the residential schools. We've got a present problem. It's not just about, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission so helpfully did, look at what our legacy is, but in their calls to action for us to achieve reconciliation, they're calling out to each one of us to take our responsibility. And that's why I'm so proud of what we're doing with TAG, the action group on improving access to justice. And you know, I get people saying to me, Grant, what's TAG? Who's TAG? Who's TAG? You are. You, the partners, the organizations, the people in Ontario who are coming together to say, we need to build a justice system that is accessible, affordable, and inclusive. And in our discussions over the next 2 days, you're going to be challenged to think of how we can make that happen. And I just want to say, this week has been amazing. We started on, if you read your Toronto Star on Monday morning, we had a research report that, again, put on the agenda what are the challenges that Ontarians face around access to justice. And I was so pleased, and a number of you were there on Tuesday when we were talking about inclusive technology, that the Attorney General of Ontario came and said, you know, there it was on the front page of the paper on Monday, and I'm committed, and my government is committed to doing something about it. And he stood up in the Ontario legislature yesterday and said it again, and he was joined by the two opposition parties to say, yes, this is an issue that we have to work on. And there's so much. Julie just said it. in terms of we're going to vote about what we're going to talk about tomorrow. We've got lots of urgent issues. But let's take a moment at the outset of this conference to focus on that deep issue of overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in the justice system. You know, it's interesting because that's the irony of it, isn't it? So often we're talking about how poor people, marginalized people, can't get access to justice. And yet in the case of Indigenous people, they're overrepresented in the system. So we need some very significant changes. And that's where I want to acknowledge the leadership of Dr. Cindy Blackstock. You've got information in your pamphlet about her background. She's a member of the Gitksan First Nation from British Columbia. She knows that I'm wearing a Dorothy Grant tie today from her territory. We're so pleased that she's here because she has been a leader for the last 25 years in fighting for justice. And today's a bit of a cloudy day. Maybe it doesn't feel so sunny with our sunny ways. Because what Cindy has been doing is making sure the federal government and all of us in this country recognize there is a huge challenge about Indigenous children and youth and communities, and we can do something about it. I'm so pleased that Cindy was able to join us at our TAG event in May when we were addressing overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and youth in the justice system. We've issued a report. It's on our website about what are the steps that could be taken to address this. Cindy's going to be talking to lawyers tonight at the Ontario Bar Association about her case, the case of the First Nations Caring Society. She's going to be at York tomorrow working around how do we reimagine child welfare in Canada for Indigenous people, for marginalized, multicultural communities. And right now, we get a chance to hear from her. Welcome, Dr. Cindy Blackstock.
So it's a great honor to be here with all of you at a time when the children need more than ever. You know, a lot of people hear the story of Charlie Winchap. They imagine this little boy walking alone on the railroad tracks, away from an abusive residential school that didn't allow him to be who he was. Or as the great historian John Malloy said, these children were punished for who their parents were. Many of us think, and we see that on the screen and in the song, that we would do something to help that boy if we have a chance. But your time is now. You are the people of this period. You are the people who know better and have an opportunity to do better. And in the conversation of reconciliation, there seems to me to always be three key players. There is a systemic embedding of racial discrimination within government policy. There are the whistleblowers who, inside and outside of government, say there is something fundamentally dangerous and wrong here. And then there are the public, those of us, the people of the period. And the question is, what do we do about it? And for far too long, we have normalized the racial discrimination in this country. We have excused it. And we have shifted the focus of fairness away from children to what's fair to the federal government. They can't change everything overnight. They're making good first steps. All of that narrative is about fairness to powerful elements. The day before Prime Minister Harper apologized for the residential schools, I was in Beechwood Cemetery, visiting this man. I don't like cemeteries very much. I grew up in the bush, and when I first saw one, they were kind of creepy and reminded me of the stuff I saw on the horror shows on CBC. So getting me to go there was quite a challenge. But this man was worth it. You see, this man is Peter Henderson Rice. He was the whistleblower. He is the person who pierces the Canadian narrative that assumes that people of the period did not know any better back then. He stands as the exception, and not just as one individual, but of many who blew the whistle on the needless deaths of children in residential schools and was persecuted for it. In 2008, I told him about the human rights case we had just brought against the government of Canada, alleging that they're racially discriminating against 163,000 First Nations children by consciously providing lesser child welfare services and failing to allow First Nations children to equitably access other public services under a principle called Jordan's Principle. And I told him I would be back when the children won. I had no idea that would be 9 years later. That would be 9 years later. Now, when you hear the words overrepresentation, that is a symptom of structural discrimination. And too often what we do in law in Canada, in child welfare law, in criminal justice, and in other areas of law, is we codify structural discrimination as a personal deficit. Now, if I was to tell you, and Grant alluded to it, that First Nations children are 12 times more likely to be in foster care than other children, and that race continues to be a factor in the removal of children, even when you control for all clinical factors, who here would say that the child welfare system is failing First Nations children? I disagree with all of them. Because in order to assess whether it's failing, you must understand what it was designed for in the first instance. This is the earliest child welfare document known in the country. Its date is 1895. It is a warrant requisitioned by Duncan Campbell Scott. Many of you know Duncan Campbell Scott as a Confederate poet, but he was also the longest-serving residential school senior bureaucrat in the federal government. And he's asking here for the warrant for the removal of First Nations children so they could be placed in residential schools. For the purposes of education, which we all know was not that. In fact, in residential schools, really the view was that First Nations were not academically inclined or suitable, so all you would do is get a grade 3 level of education. There was another reason, and it was because they were not properly cared for. Not properly cared for. Now, if you look at the not properly cared for regulations that accompany this warrant, they very closely map onto contemporary definitions of neglect for which First Nations children are being removed. It is about poverty. It is about poor housing. It is about the unresolved trauma resulting from colonization. And it's about child welfare's lack of addressing those issues. When we confront families that have those problems, we send them off to parenting classes because we codify it as a parenting issue. But if I cut water off from all of you in your family homes, I reduced all of your public services by 30 to 50%. And I came back to check on you and your kids a year later and found out that you aren't doing as well as I hoped, and sent you to parenting classes. How effective do you think that would be? And yet, that's the reflex of our current child welfare system. Now, what about these inequities? How is it possible that our federal government is out canvassing the human rights records of international communities? We are criticizing the narrative of Trump, rightfully so, on racial discrimination, a whole broad array of matters. But how is it that we do that and yet we insulate ourselves from our Mississippi and our Confederate flag? Which is, since Confederation, the federal government has provided less funding for child welfare, education, and health on reserves, and they have spun a narrative amongst Canadians that assumes that First Nations people get more. So these children have multiple hardships. They get less for education. They get less for child welfare. They get less for early childhood. They get less for education. And they're judged as if they get more. It doesn't matter how credible the people are documenting the inequality. Sheila Fraser did it in 18 different reviews. And I think we can all agree in this room she's considered one of the best Auditor Generals we've had. She documents it. She says she's profoundly disappointed that the government of Canada is not doing what is necessary to reform its programs and ensure these kids get an equal chance. But what Sheila Fraser does not write about is what I see every day in these First Nations communities. This is a picture of a young girl in Athabasca. Her school sits next to a toxic waste dump. Her high school is so underfunded that even if she graduates top of her class, because there is no science equipment, there is no library, there is no computers, she'll be at least 2 years behind every other student in Ontario. And what does she think about herself? She wonders if she's stupid. Because these kids start to internalize racism as being about them. It's no wonder we see the prolific youth suicide rates in this country. It is not enough to provide adequate mental health, although that's essential and culturally appropriate. We must address the hardships and the bags of sand that we put on the hopes and dreams of these children. And we must change Canadian attitudes so that there is less judgment on these children and more judgment and calls to action on the federal government to end this racial discrimination against kids. It's fundamental to the conscience of the nation. It is, to me, the most egregious human rights issue that is currently there because it's state-based racial discrimination at its worst. So, in 2007, I'm a social worker by training, and I found ourselves, we had worked on 2 solutions with the federal government over a period of 10 years. And if you look at the law, if you look at the history of Canada's relationship with First Nations children in the rearview mirror, what we find is review after review after review, documenting the inequalities, documenting the harms to kids, providing solutions to the government to reform it, and the government doesn't do it. And the attention is about First Nations capacity building. But what we need to do is shift that attention to why the government is not doing better when it knows better. Almost nobody looks at that question. So after we have researched this for 10 years, and then the government minister himself sends us letters commending us for the review, but takes no action to remediate it, we knew that while we were sitting at those tables, the numbers of First Nations children entering child welfare care had increased 71.5%. So we had to do something about it. But what does a small organization like mine do? And when I say small, I mean small. We are, the Caring Society has 1 full-time staff and 3 part-time staff. But we have a great teaching, and I pass it on to all of you by an elder, because I think it's instructive in living a good and just life. He said, I'm proud of you because you guys created the Caring Society to be a voice for First Nations children, but never fall in love with the Caring Society. And never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children because there may come a time when you have to sacrifice all those things for them. We were funded by the federal government. We filed, along with the Assembly of First Nations, a legal case against Canada under pursuant to the Canadian Human Rights Act, alleging that they're racially discriminating against 163,000 children. Within 30 days, all of our federal court funding was cut, and shortly thereafter, all federal government funding was cut. We had $50,000 in the bank. The court challenges program only funded charter cases and then was eliminated very quickly thereafter. And I remember a lot of my colleagues saying, what you've done is so silly, because now there's not going to be an organization like yours to speak out about First Nations kids, because the mainstream children's organizations aren't really doing it. You're going to go down. And I said, yes, you might be right about that. We might go down. But I want this generation of First Nations children to know one thing, that we loved and cared for them enough to stand up for them. And if the Caring Society ceases to exist because we've done that, then let it go. Something amazing happens when you do something like that. A letter arrived in the mail for me, and it was in pencil crayon on the outside. I think the best letters come in pencil crayon on the outside. And it was Chuck, which should scare me because, you know, as you know, the case goes on, and there's a rather dark history with the case, but it does, and it has a nice ringing sound as I walk. And I opened it up, and it said, "Dear Cindy, here's something MUNY for the kids, love Ellen." And inside was $1.67 from her piggy bank. We never ask children for a dime, but children are experts in love and fairness. And they see when something's wrong. They know it's not okay to give a group of children less because of their race in this country, and they want to do something to stop it. So children, still today, are the most frequent donors to the Caring Society. We are still the only national organization that gets nothing from any level of government. And yet, I think that what we've been able to do has been because of the spirit and engagement of children. And they have enjoyed the I Am a Witness campaign. What we did is we took the case, and discrimination's best friend is silence in a turned head. And that's how Canada's been able to perpetuate this for many years, keep it in the dark and normalize it for Canadians. So we created this campaign, a web-based campaign, and we load all of the Government of Canada's documents, all of our documents. I don't ask you to take a side, and I don't ask kids to take a side. I simply ask you to watch. Watch it. Make up your own mind about what's happening. It respects judicial independence. It gives the public a pathway in to understanding and participating in the case. And now there are over 15,000 individuals and organizations. It's the most watched human rights case in Canadian history. So these are the parties to the case. The Assembly of First Nations and ourselves. The Assembly of First Nations, by the way, got 100% of its funding in child and family within 30 days as well, right? So this is what democracy, this is what happens here with democracy. I'm going to talk a bit about access to justice here, because what I did not understand, I actually thought when we filed the case, the government would come to its senses and do the right thing for the kids, right? You know, I was stunned, I'm still stunned. Why did we have to bring the Government of Canada to court to get them to treat little kids fairly? Why? You know, how is that? Why did we need to do that? And then to see what unfolded over the next number of years was absolutely stunning to me, right? Where they fought this thing endlessly on procedural grounds. Their arguments were all about fairness to the federal government, which to me is unconscionable, right? Because we experienced hardship too at the Caring Society, but that's our job as adults, is to stand up for kids. I don't have a right as an adult to complain about the stress that I'm under when 163,000 children are being racially discriminated against. But the federal government's arguments were this. The service argument. We, the federal government, only fund First Nations agencies to provide child welfare. If they're receiving less funding for child welfare and providing lesser of a service, it's the social workers discriminating, not us as the federal government. That's the argument number one. Argument number two, it's unfair to compare the services the federal government provides to First Nations to the services received by all other Canadians via the provinces. In the entire time this case has been litigated, the Government of Canada has failed to present one argument on the best interests of children. And throughout the long procedural history of this case, they have, behind the scenes, because they also withheld documents from us. Some of you know about their failure to disclose and obstruction of justice. But they withheld about 90,000 documents, and in those documents, they confirm things like, they're their own words, they say, the underfunding is creating a situation that's dire, where First Nations children are not receiving equal benefit under the law, where First Nations children are being driven into child welfare at unprecedented rates, where children are more likely to die as a result. So all of this is happening in the scenes while this is playing out in the courts. And I think this is a lesson to us all that we need to pressure their judicial systems to expedite cases that are systemic on children, right? Because unlike you and I might, and you'll see in the film, We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, the NFB documentary on the case, you'll see that I slowly get older as the case goes on. And my glasses change quite a bit as I go through all these years, and they get stronger, really. But the children, their developmental stage is so essential. You know, think about the time this case has been filed. A baby is now in grade 4, right? So we need to expedite these cases. Here's the kids in the federal court. So many of the children started to come to the court that we had to book them in shifts. And I think this is one of the wonderful things that I'd like to remind everybody here is under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, children have a right to participate in judicial actions. No one's ever done it in a systemic case because they think kids don't understand systemic cases. And this was during the time when Canada was trying to get it kicked out on the comparator issue. And these kids are in the audience, right? Imagine yourself as Canada litigating this case. Would you rather turn around and see an audience like you or them? And kids are wonderful, right? They bring a special spirit into the room. They all wanted autographs of all the lawyers. They have autograph books. And some of the lawyers, I won't name who, were trying to, I don't think we're into that. But the kids were smart, and they realized that these lawyers in this court have to wear these special uniforms. And there's a room where they go to put on these robes. So all you gotta do as an autograph taker is stand by the robe room and just get them to sign up. Now your only hope is that they don't understand. And I wondered that too, whether they would developmentally understand. But I come out of the room and this hearing had to be moved to the Supreme Court because there were so many kids wanting to come. And there's a little boy there, he's in about grade 3, 4, and he flags me over, right? We're over here. And I told the kids that being a witness, I don't want you to believe that there's inequalities just because I say so. And I say that to you too. If you're skeptical, that's good. But try to prove me wrong. I invite the debate. And I say to the kids, go listen to all sides of the story. Be like a newspaper reporter. Do your research online. Talk to your teachers and your friends, and then decide what you think is going on. And then if it's something that you're worried about and you would like the country to do better, here's the Prime Minister's address, write him a letter. So this little boy said he came to the Canada's Day because he had already heard my side of the story. He said, we already listened to you. That's why I'm here listening to that. And he flips over a piece of paper. You know the scores, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the hashtags. Long list on one side and a short list on the other. And he said, you know what this is? He said the long list is when the judge, and that was Justice McTavish, the judge asked the Canada people a question. And the short list is when the Canada people answer. One little kindergarten girl who came to the hearing, she said, I thought this case was about what's best for kids. So why are the Canada people talking about what's best for kids? Isn't that really the question? Why isn't that? Why wasn't that the question? Why wasn't we litigating that? Why was it all this procedural? And in the background of this case, unseen by the bureaucrats in Ottawa perhaps, maybe they were distanced from it, and not on the radar of the Department of Justice in any real way, was this document. It came into evidence at the tribunal. It's an Excel spreadsheet in its original form. I told you that First Nations children are overrepresented by a factor of 12 times more likely to be in foster care. Over half of the children in foster care are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. And there are 3 times as many First Nations kids in state care today than at the height of residential schools. But you've become used to hearing it that way. This spreadsheet shows how children themselves think about it. How many nights do I see my mom? And if you count up the number of nights of First Nations children on reserve only and in the Yukon have spent in foster care between 1989 and 2012, it's over 66 million nights, or 187,000 years of child. That's the price that they're paying. Contrast that against the Government of Canada's arguments that we can't change things overnight, that we're making good first steps. I'm not interested in first steps. We've already done those over the last 149 years. And a first step only matters if there's a second and third step. And why are First Nations children the only children in this country who are condemned to an existence on the basis of incremental equality. Right? Why is it that we're okay subsidizing other projects by the federal government based on racial discrimination against them? What is the children losing to that we can't fund them equity? Well, over the summer, what we heard was they were losing to the $7 billion of investments in things like tennis courts and flagpoles. That's the priorities that we have. As my mom said, and many other people say, there's no excuse for discrimination against kids. This is one of the documents they withheld. You can see it here. Oops, what did I think? Did something. You can see here that it's a secret document. If you know that you're underfunding kids, then why keep it a secret, right? This is the stuff they don't want the public to know. Because in their speaking points, they're talking about all the good stuff they're doing for kids. But you can see the shortfall there from 2012 and it's significant. This is another document that's protected. And it also shows the inequalities in education and other programs for kids. And instead of addressing those inequalities, what they're doing is transferring money from programs like housing and water and fire protection to cover up the shortfalls. But even that isn't enough. So this is the evidence the government of Canada had all those years. Here's another one, showing that if you're a First Nations child and you have a disability and require a wheelchair or lift in a stroller, you only get one piece of equipment every 5 years. So to get all 3 pieces of equipment will take at least 15 years. But a similarly situated non-Aboriginal child off reserve gets all those pieces of equipment in that province immediately. This is a Health Canada IMAC document, so it's not as if they don't know, right? Now, confronted by this wave of its own evidence and its own expert report that went against it, the government contracted KPMG, they paid them $440,000 or something like that, to try to discount our calculations of the shortfall. But unfortunately for the government, KPMG came within 1% of our calculations of the shortfall. So we actually filed the federal government's expert report on our side of the case, which is good because I couldn't afford KPMG. So, you know, we do our own janitorial just to try and make our rent payment. So this is the government's actual written submissions, and it's very interesting to me here as a non-lawyer. You can see, of course, they're having to deal with all these internal documents that really are admissions against interest. But they say, no, they're not admissions of what you guys do. This overshoots the mark, they're saying. These actually are the personal views of our employees at different periods of time. But the government brought no evidence that these INAC PowerPoints were personal views. And even if they were personal views, that they were wrong, right? But these are the written submissions written on behalf of Canadians. Of course, we have the decision that comes down in January. The tribunal finds that Canada is racially discriminating against 163,000 children in ways that incentivize removals and widens the disadvantage of residential schools. It was covered very well by the media for a few days, but then it got replaced by a story the public found more interesting, that you, the people of the period, found more interesting, and that was heckling in Parliament. The government never complied with that order. They don't do anything until Budget 2016, when they announced $71 million for child welfare. Once we tease that apart, it turns out $10 million of that is actually going to the department to hire new staff and for other projects. So only $61 million is going towards this, eliminating the discrimination. That falls $38 million short of what the Conservatives thought was needed in 2012, and $155 million short of what our estimates are. The federal government, the tribunal, is dissatisfied with Canada's compliance and issues 2 further compliance orders against the federal government. And still, this isn't on the front page of the story because we, the people of the period, are not demanding that it's on the front page of the story. But Christy Kirkrup, a Canadian press lawyer, reporter, did ask Prime Minister Trudeau about it and said, you know, Prime Minister Trudeau, you're confronted now by 3 legal orders asking to ruin racial discrimination against kids. And he went on to talk about the historic investments the government has made in Indigenous peoples. And that they are the one government that has finally showed up on this one. And she said, yes, but Prime Minister, if the $71 million is not good enough for the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, then why is it good enough for you? He then says that we need to do better for First Nations kids. But so doing better sounds discretionary. They need to follow the law. They need to comply with the law. And Canada's failure to observe the rulings under the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal process should be a dark signal to any equality-seeking group in this country. If the Canadian government is setting an example to say you can obfuscate any ruling by the tribunal simply by not just ignoring it, then what does that mean for that employer who's discriminating against persons with disabilities? What does that mean for that school who refuses to allow a transgender child to attend a graduation? What does it mean for all of these equity-seeking groups when the government itself will be bound by that order? So, we are the people of the period, and there is something you can do. You can sign up to be a witness at the I Am a Witness campaign. You can go watch the National Film Board's documentary in this case called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, which will be actually at Imaginative on the 22nd of October. So you can go see it right here in Toronto. You can write to the Prime Minister. You can educate people in your legal profession, and you can give thanks to the lawyers on our team who have worked for brownies and cookies all these years and stood up for the justice of these kids. And you can also work to ensure that children's cases never again spend 9 years in a court on technical issues without giving due consideration to the harms, the egregious harms to kids. And most of all, you can fight to ensure that this racial discrimination ends for these children and for the country before Canada's 150th birthday. I don't want balloons for Canada's 150th birthday. I don't want a piece of cake. I want something far more fundamental, and that is to bring this country into alignment with its vision and to ensure this generation of First Nations children never have to recover from their childhoods. And this generation of non-Aboriginal kids, they never have to grow up to save their soul. Thank you very much.